The obsession with noise is the great affliction of the modern soul. We are terrified of silence, constantly seeking validation in the crowd, perpetually binding ourselves to external demands. Look around at the world. Every person is striving for connection, for inclusion, for the ultimate affirmation found, or so they believe, in the commitment to another person, symbolized by that singular, heavy band of metal worn on the finger. This ring, this apparent sign of belonging and success, is hailed as the pinnacle of human achievement. We are taught that the man who commits is stable, grounded, and ultimately happy. But what about the man who rejects this covenant? The one who stands apart, free of the ring, free of the constant consuming obligation that defines the partnered life. Society often views him as incomplete, perhaps damaged, maybe lonely. They see a void where a connection should be. They pity his perceived solitude. Yet Arthur Schopenhauer, the philosopher of intellectual pessimism and brutal honesty, saw this man not as lacking, but as possessing the highest form of secular royalty. The man with no ring, Schopenhauer suggests, often lives in a silence that is richer, more profound, and more autonomous than the supposed majesty of any king bound by consensus and courtly demands. This quiet pursuit of autonomy isn't confined to any one place or cultural climate. The struggle for intellectual freedom is universal. I am curious where this revelation finds you right now. Tell me the name of the city, the place where you are contemplating this idea of sovereign independence, because understanding the world's noise requires knowing where you stand in its geography. Schopenhauer fundamentally believed that all human existence is defined by suffering, driven by the ceaseless, blind will. Our attempts to achieve happiness are futile because happiness is merely a negative concept, the momentary absence of pain or desire. Pleasure is brief, the return of need is inevitable. And here is where the man with no ring achieves his silent, radical advantage. By avoiding the fundamental commitment of marriage, he skillfully avoids multiplying the sources of his potential suffering. He denies the will its most complicated and demanding domain. The married life, according to this grim but penetrating worldview, is an elaborate system of self-imposed chains, dramatically increasing the complexity and volume of the suffering matrix. The man who accepts the ring enters into a partnership that is not merely emotional, but logistical, financial, and metaphysical. He becomes immediately accountable for the feelings, fortunes, fears, and future of at least one other soul, often more. Schopenhauer argues that the vast majority of human companionship springs not from genuine spiritual affinity, but from the terror of solitude and the desperate need to dissipate the heavy burden of existence through shared distraction. Most people cannot stand their own company because their inner resources are shallow and easily depleted. They need the external stimulus of a relationship, the constant drama, the shared planning, the endless conversation, to keep the fundamental boredom and meaninglessness of life at bay. The man with no ring has overcome this fear. He has faced the void of solitude and found within it not emptiness but a universe. His silence is not a consequence of being excluded. It is a conscious, strategic choice of inclusion in his own sovereign interiority. He is independent because he has mastered the art of being a self-sufficient audience. Think about the sheer energetic cost of the partnered life. Every decision must pass through a filter of dual consent. Every expenditure of time or money requires negotiation. The domestic environment becomes a theater of perpetual petty compromises, where two individual wills, fundamentally oriented toward their own self-preservation and desires, must continuously grind against each other. This friction is the antithesis of the quiet royalty Schopenhauer champions. The man in silence is the sole legislator of his domain. He owns every minute of his day, every resource in his environment, and every thought in his head without the obligation of reporting, explaining, or justifying. This independence is the true crown. When Schopenhauer speaks of living like royalty, he is not speaking of material wealth, though that independence often follows. He is speaking of autarky, self-rule, the unmarried philosopher, the self-contained scholar, the man who cultivates his garden of thought free from external weeds, possesses a freedom that money cannot buy and titles cannot confer. He is immune to the tyranny of the contingent, the endless, unexpected demands, crises, and obligations that spring from binding one's fate to another person's trajectory. Consider the ordinary man. His day is dictated by external schedules, family meals, social functions, managing the emotional landscape of his partner, attending to the needs of his dependents. His mental energy is constantly fragmented, diverted into maintenance, negotiation, and conflict resolution. He sacrifices intellectual depth for relational breadth. His life is a compromise. The man in silence, however, retains complete control over his most valuable asset, his mental focus. His mind is his fortress, and he dictates who and what is allowed entry. This single-minded dedication allows him to achieve a level of sustained intellectual labor, a depth of contemplation, and a capacity for pure creation that is simply unattainable for those whose existence is constantly interrupted by the necessities and emergencies of a shared life. Schopenhauer believed that true genius requires this isolation, this profound silence, because great minds are fundamentally incompatible with the mundane, repetitive, and often foolish concerns of the majority. The genius must protect his mind from the common current, and the easiest way to ensure contamination is to permanently bind oneself to it. The ring, therefore, becomes a heavy anchor, dragging the aspiring thinker back to the shore of the ordinary. The unmarried man is the intellectual sailor, free to navigate the tempestuous, lonely waters of pure thought, charting courses into territories that the shore-bound cannot even imagine. This is why his silence is royalty. Silence, in the Schopenhauerian context, is the absence of external clamor, which allows the internal voice of reason and introspection to become audible. In this profound quiet, the man begins to truly possess himself. He replaces the search for fleeting external gratification with the enduring construction of his internal world. He is building his kingdom brick by philosophical brick. Furthermore, the man who lives in this silence avoids one of the greatest sources of Schopenhauerian suffering: disillusionment. We enter relationships projecting our idealized notions onto another human being, believing they will complete us or solve our existential problems. Schopenhauer warns that humans are intrinsically flawed, driven by egoism and the will. The closer we are forced to live with another person, the more clearly their flaws, irritations, and fundamental incompatibility with our own will become apparent. The ring often leads not to perfect harmony, but to an excruciating, unavoidable intimacy with imperfection. The man with no ring, having opted out of this great wager, remains an observer. He engages with the world selectively, on his own terms, maintaining a necessary distance that preserves his objectivity and prevents the contamination of mutual disappointment. His loneliness is thus protective. It is a chosen barrier against the inevitable betrayal of expectation that companionship brings. This choice of solitude is not misanthropy, though it often involves a sharp critique of human nature. It is simply a declaration of self-reliance, recognizing that the highest joy available to a thinking person comes from within, through knowledge, art, and philosophical contemplation, rather than from the unstable dependency on external emotional variables. The ordinary person sees the single man dining alone, traveling alone, pursuing hobbies alone, and interprets this as a lack. Schopenhauer teaches us to reverse this interpretation. This is not lack, this is abundance. This man has so much within himself that he does not need to use another person as an emotional crutch or a distraction device. He is his own best company. His time spent in reflection is not wasted time. It is investment in the one entity he can truly control and rely upon, his own consciousness. The rejection of the ring is thus an act of supreme philosophical courage. It is standing against the enormous weight of societal expectation, against the biological imperative, and against the general human fear of being alone. It is a decision to prioritize intellectual and spiritual liberty above all else, including the fleeting comfort of shared warmth. The man who truly lives like royalty in silence is not isolated. He is insulated. He maintains a dignified distance from the chaotic marketplace of human emotions and needs. He transforms his solitude from a deficit into a formidable asset. He has the freedom to wander, the freedom to change his mind, the freedom to pursue the most difficult truths without having to temper his conclusions for the sake of domestic peace or shared comfort. His life is a trajectory of maximum velocity, unburdened by the drag of dual responsibility. He is, simply put, his own master, an autonomy that Schopenhauer considered the most precious and fragile condition a human could ever achieve. The greatest misconception about this silent royalty is the idea that it is passive. On the contrary, Maintaining this state of sovereign independence requires constant, active discipline. It demands that the individual cultivate an inner life rich enough to sustain itself, a mind sharp enough to be its own stimulus, and a will strong enough to resist the incessant siren call of social inclusion. This is a life defined by high standards, rigorously applied to the self. It is a commitment to depth over volume, and this brings us back to the central contrast, the noise of the world versus the silence of the sovereign self. The partnered life often demands noise, social events, shared media, external entertainment, and the necessary communication to manage the joint existence. The solitary man demands silence because silence is the necessary precondition for deep work and profound introspection. He knows that true insight does not shout, it whispers, and it can only be heard when the external volume is turned down entirely. The quality of a man's life is determined by his inner world, not his external relationships, and the quality of the inner world is inextricably linked to the freedom from external demands. The man with no ring has chosen his side in the great Schopenhauerian war. He fights for the liberation of the intellect, ensuring that his inner royalty remains uncontested. He may appear alone on the outside, but inside, he reigns supreme, a monarch over a kingdom of self-contained thought. We've discussed the profound liberation found in Schopenhauer's silence and the true cost of external validation. If this perspective resonated with your deepest drive for autonomy, I need you to anchor this idea in the comments right now. Type this phrase in the comments below. Silence is my crown because claiming your inner royalty begins with a declaration of intent. Do not hesitate to join this rapidly growing community of strategic thinkers. Hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell immediately to ensure you never miss the strategies of profound living. In the next part, we will pivot to the psychological defense mechanisms employed by the silent monarch. We will dissect the most common error the ordinary man makes when judging the solitary life, revealing the specific reason why this intellectual sovereignty is virtually immune to the world's attacks. Do not miss the next deep dissection of power. Picture this: a gold-plated cage. The bars are made of shared mortgages, joint bank accounts, and the heavy weight of mutual obligation. Inside sits a man, technically provided for, admired even, yet perpetually constrained by the necessity of constant communication, compromise, and the doubling of his existence. Now envision the man with no ring. He stands outside that cage observing, his solitude not an absence, but a sovereign territory. His silence is the sound of an uninterrupted kingdom, a realm where every decision is unilateral, every resource is his alone, and every hour belongs to the cultivation of his own mind. This is the radical freedom that Arthur Schopenhauer illuminated, the reason why this man, dismissed by society as lonely or incomplete, lives not just comfortably, but with a quiet dignity reserved for true royalty. Before we step further into this philosophy of radical freedom, I want to know where this silent royalty is reigning. Tell me now, in the comments below, what city are you watching this from? We must begin part 2 by dissecting the central engine of human misery, according to Schopenhauer, the will. The will is the blind, incessant, striving force underlying all existence, the engine of desire that keeps us perpetually unsatisfied. Society, with its relentless push towards pairing and procreation, views marriage and lifelong commitment not merely as a social contract, but as the fundamental expression of this will. It is the will demanding its immediate perpetuation and expansion. The man with no ring refuses this primary demand. He refuses the ultimate entanglement, which is not merely sharing a life, but integrating two wills, two sets of desires, two systems of suffering, into one volatile matrix. The man who marries, by Schopenhauer's measure, essentially volunteers to double his potential for pain and multiply his dependencies. Every expectation, every disappointment, every minor illness, every financial worry that belongs to his partner immediately becomes his own. He is no longer solely responsible for his own suffering. He has taken on a cosigner for existential misery. This is the hidden cost of the visible security society champions. The man with no ring, however, enjoys a sublime form of self-imposed quarantine from the general epidemic of domestic anxiety. His freedom is the radical non-extension of his personal will into the complicated, unpredictable territory of another person's needs. He reserves his energy, his emotional capital, and his time for battles he chooses, not for the perpetual skirmishes inherent in sustained relational proximity. Schopenhauer believed that true genius and profound contemplation could only flourish in isolation. The mind, the single greatest asset a man possesses, requires silence, not chatter. The daily demands of a committed life, the endless cycle of domestic scheduling, the emotional maintenance, the requirement to be present, engaged, and synchronized, are fundamentally antithetical to deep philosophical inquiry or creative production. These duties, however small individually, accumulate into a crushing weight of fragmented attention. The man with no ring operates on a different temporal plane. His time is sovereign. It is his kingdom's greatest resource, and he invested entirely in his intellectual and personal dominion. When we speak of royalty in this context, we are not speaking of opulence, though often that is a byproduct. We are speaking of autonomy. The king dictates the schedule of the court. He does not negotiate the timing of dinner or the allocation of weekend energy. The unmarried man controls his spatial and temporal environment without the need for constant energy-draining consultation. He can dedicate 4 hours to a demanding intellectual pursuit without interruption. He can spontaneously choose to travel, to move, or to pursue a radically new discipline without navigating the complexities of joint consent, shared professional sacrifices, or the established inertia of a shared home. This radical fluidity is the actual golden crown he wears in silence. It grants him a competitive advantage in a world where attention is the ultimate currency, and distraction is the universal tax. Consider the financial dimension of this sovereignty. Marriage, particularly within modern middle-class structures, often imposes an implicit contract of maintaining appearances. The bigger house, the appropriate holidays, the investment in shared status symbols. These are not merely expenditures. They are chains forged in gold. They necessitate a constant, often exhausting level of earning, forcing the married man into professional compromises he might otherwise reject. He works not for his own fulfillment, but to service the needs of an expanded economic unit. The man with no ring, conversely, retains absolute control over his earned capital. His financial decisions are based purely on his own long-term objectives and his intellectual pursuits. He can choose the path of voluntary poverty if it allows for greater mental freedom, or he can accumulate wealth with a singular focus, knowing that his resources will be deployed solely according to his own strategy. This is not selfishness. It is the ultimate expression of rational self-governance, a form of financial minimalism that maximizes life liberty. Schopenhauer deeply explored the nature of happiness, positing that it is not a positive experience to be achieved, but merely the absence of pain and suffering. Pain. The domestic sphere, while promising happiness, is in reality a breeding ground for constant low-level suffering, born from incompatibility, compromise, and the persistent presence of friction. Two human beings, each driven by a unique egotistical will, cannot permanently coexist in perfect alignment. There will be constant minor clashes over aesthetic choices, routines, personal habits, and emotional needs. These are the small, insidious miseries that erode the spirit far more effectively than any major disaster. The man who lives alone avoids this constant erosion. He creates an environment perfectly tailored to his own eccentricities and needs. His peace is not the result of successful negotiation, but of inherent design. When Schopenhauer speaks of living like royalty, he refers to this psychological state, the absence of nagging demands, the silence of internal debate over external obligations. His home becomes a fortress against the world's noise and the internal dissonance of dual existence. This quiet life of contemplation allows him to pursue the higher, more meaningful forms of satisfaction, those derived from knowledge, art, and philosophical understanding, which Schopenhauer deemed the only escapes from the tyranny of the will. The married man, often consumed by the logistics of domestic management and the needs of his dependents, rarely has the mental bandwidth to ascend to these rarefied heights of introspection. Furthermore, the man with no ring avoids the most precarious dependency of all, the reliance on external validation for emotional stability. The committed partner often requires constant emotional affirmation, reassurance, and mirroring. This dependency on another human being for happiness is, in Schopenhauer's view, the ultimate vulnerability. It makes one a hostage to the mood, stability, and affection of an inherently unpredictable entity. The man who chooses solitude cultivates self-reliance as his primary emotional infrastructure. His contentment is self-referential. His confidence is self-generated. He is not looking across the table for approval. He is looking inward for substance. This self-contained emotional economy is the hallmark of genuine independence, placing him above the petty dramas and relational politics that consume the energy of his coupled peers. Society looks at this solitary figure and sees risk, loneliness, and failure to conform. Schopenhauer teaches us to reverse the gaze. The man with no ring looks at the conformist masses and sees risk, the risk of subsuming one's sovereign self into a collective unit driven by herd instinct and arbitrary social expectations. He sees the profound lack of silence, the squandering of temporal capital, and the multiplication of pain. His silence is misunderstood as emptiness, when in reality, it is the sound of his profound engagement with the internal world. It is the necessary quiet required for listening to one's own deepest truths, unmixed with the clamor of external obligation. He trades the noisy shared life of low-grade misery for the silent private life of high-level contemplation. This is the strategic withdrawal that grants him his royal perch. This sovereignty is not static. It is a continuous achievement maintained by the discipline of non-attachment. Every morning, the man with no ring wakes up and renews his commitment to his own existence. He is accountable only to the standards he sets for himself, a freedom that allows for maximum ethical and intellectual integrity. He does not have to compromise his philosophical stance or his artistic vision to accommodate a partner's comfort level or societal acceptance. He is free to be radically authentic, even abrasive in his pursuit of truth, because he has no external fortress to defend, no delicate relational ecosystem to protect. He is a philosopher king ruling over a kingdom of one, his mind. This elevation of the individual will, untethered from domestic entanglement, grants him a profound psychological advantage, the removal of the fear of relational loss. The married man perpetually labors under the implicit threat of marital failure, divorce, or the loss of his partner, which represents a catastrophic dismantling of his entire life structure, financial, emotional, and social. The man who relies only on himself is immune to this specific form of existential terror. His structure is robust because it is singular. While he is certainly vulnerable to the universal afflictions of life, he has strategically eliminated the possibility of destruction through dual-party relational collapse. This internal security allows him a steadiness, a quiet gravitas, that those perpetually negotiating a shared existence can rarely attain. His independence is his greatest armor, and his solitude is his impenetrable shield. We have established the foundation of this silent royalty, the liberation from the will's primary trap, the achievement of temporal and financial sovereignty, and the critical importance of solitude for intellectual ascent. But the question remains, how does this man leverage this unique freedom to interact with the world? How does his silence become a language of power that others instinctively respect? We must now turn our attention to the culmination of this Schopenhauerian strategy, the active demonstration of that internal royalty, the practical applications of non-attachment, and the ultimate, terrifying freedom that comes with recognizing life as fundamentally defined by the refusal of delusion. The true meaning of his silence, and the reason others perceive him as possessing an almost regal calm, lies not just in what he avoids, but in what he achieves. This man's existence is a living critique of the conventional life, a silent testament to the idea that true wealth is measured in uncompromised hours and autonomous thought, not in shared property and mutual commitment. His power derives from the fact that he needs nothing from the relational structures that define others. He is the ultimate free agent, possessing an independence that others envy even as they condemn his path. His royalty is internal, and his wealth is measured in the luxury of his undisturbed thought. We have begun the journey into this radical philosophy of self-sovereignty. If the concept of escaping the will's trap and claiming true temporal freedom resonates deeply with the silent king inside you, then you must affirm this truth right now. Write this phrase in the comments. Silence is my crown. Secure your place in this conversation. The future wisdom we uncover together demands your consistent presence. Hit the like button to signal that this pursuit of genuine internal power is valuable, and subscribe instantly to join the exclusive few who are willing to shed societal illusion for radical truth. Because in the final part, we will reveal the ultimate strategic move, how the man with no ring transforms his mere solitude into an enduring legacy, and why his silent reign grants him an authority that the loudest, most connected men can only dream of possessing. The quiet strategy is always the most lethal. Be ready for the ultimate reveal. The crown of the solitary man is forged not in gold, but in the absolute sovereignty over his own time. We have navigated the treacherous waters of the will, witnessed the catastrophic compromise of the common life, and observed the man with no ring securing his perimeter against the fundamental tragedy of existence. Now, we arrive at the final summation, the definitive answer to why this existence is synonymous with philosophical royalty. This royalty is not measured by the depth of his coffers or the size of his lands, but by the immeasurable expanse of his intellectual domain and the untrammeled freedom of his mind. The common man is a slave to the cycle of wanting, suffering, and temporary gratification, the cruel treadmill of the will. The solitary man has stepped off that treadmill entirely, choosing instead the quiet service of the intellect, and in doing so, he attains a quality of existence that the masses, bound by their noisy demands and compulsory social structures, can never comprehend. Before we complete this final architectural blueprint of sovereignty, I ask you, from what great city are you claiming your intellectual independence today? The definitive act of royalty is the preservation of internal peace. The married or socially bound man lives perpetually in a state of negotiation, a constant state of low-grade war waged over trivialities, domestic arrangements, financial compromises, the emotional demands of dependence, and the suffocating noise of dual or multiple existences merged imperfectly. Schopenhauer teaches us that such a life requires a constant output of psychic energy simply to maintain equilibrium, energy that is perpetually diverted from the highest human purpose, contemplation. The man with no ring, conversely, experiences an uninterrupted flow of internal resource. His home is a sanctuary, not a battleground. His silence is not a void to be filled, but a fertile ground for thought, a prerequisite for genius. He possesses the supreme luxury, the power to shut the door and know with absolute certainty that the only disturbance he will encounter is that which he himself invites. This quietude is the highest form of self-defense, a moat surrounding the true fortress of the self. To live like royalty is to control access to your most valuable resource, your cognitive capacity. The philosopher king refuses to outsource his happiness or his emotional stability to external variables, be they spouses, children, or societal approval. This refusal is the genesis of autarky. The common man is tethered to others, requiring their validation to feel worthy, their presence to feel whole, their drama to feel alive. This dependency is the mark of the psychological serf. The man with no ring, having made the definitive break, relies solely on the inexhaustible, portable kingdom within his own mind. He cultivates interests, delves into literature, science, and music, building an interior world so rich and complex that external events lose their power to wound or distract. His self-worth is internally verified, rendering him immune to the bartering and transactional nature of societal relationships. This immunity is what defines his regal status. He does not need the world, he observes it. He does not participate in its compulsory drama, he analyzes it. This separation transforms him from an actor on the stage of life into the critical observer in the private box, a vantage point that is fundamentally superior. The depth of this philosophical royalty is revealed in his relationship to suffering. While Schopenhauer recognized suffering as endemic to existence, the solitary man minimizes suffering by eliminating its most volatile vector, the shared life. The common life multiplies points of potential tragedy. Every illness of a child, every failure of a spouse, every financial setback tied to another person's judgment becomes a direct hit to the self. The detached philosopher, however, reduces the field of fire to his own single entity. His suffering is solitary, manageable, and most importantly, often intellectualized. The sorrow that remains is the profound, generalized sorrow of human existence, which, paradoxically, is less sharp and debilitating than the specific, interpersonal pain of betrayal, obligation, or regret. His royalty is the ability to choose his own burdens, accepting the weight of contemplation while shedding the unbearable, arbitrary weight of shared misfortune. He trades the noisy, superficial comfort of shared life for the deep, resonant satisfaction of self-possession. Furthermore, the man with no ring lives above the most destructive of Schopenhauer's illusions, the sexual will, Maya, and the tragedy of progeny. The majority of men are manipulated into the domestic sphere not by rational choice, but by the blind, overwhelming imperative of the species to reproduce. They become tools of the will, sacrificing their intellect, their peace, and their freedom for the fleeting promise of genetic continuance. This is the profound deceit of nature, and the ultimate prison. The man who chooses solitude has seen through this trick. He has elevated the purpose of his life beyond mere biology. His legacy is not tied to fragile flesh and uncertain inheritance, but to ideas, to creations of the mind, and to the perfected tranquility of his existence. This victory over the will, this definitive refusal to be merely a biological functionary, is the highest form of liberation attainable in this world. It is a rebellion against nature itself, a claim to be an end in himself, rather than a means for the species. This existential independence is the very definition of royalty. This lifestyle grants him an unparalleled psychological integrity. While the married man must constantly adjust his behavior, mask his true thoughts, and compromise his principles to maintain domestic harmony or social standing, the man with no ring enjoys the severe, uncompromising luxury of total intellectual honesty. He does not need to flatter, pretend, or conform. His every action is accountable only to the exacting standards of his own philosophy. He can pursue truths, however unpopular or unsettling, without fearing the judgment of his immediate circle or the disruption of his home. This rigorous authenticity is the deep, silent current of his power. It is the antithesis of the public performer, the man who lives his life for the benefit of others' perception. The philosopher lives for himself, a concept so alien and so potent in a world obsessed with outward signaling that it immediately elevates him above the common masses. He is, simply put, his own jurisdiction. The final element of this regal existence is the quality of his relationships, or the lack thereof. The solitary man understands the truth of Schopenhauer's porcupine dilemma. The closer one gets, the more one suffers. Therefore, he maintains a respectful distance. His associations are rare, chosen with meticulous care, and based purely on shared intellectual pursuit, not emotional necessity or social obligation. When he does engage, it is from a position of strength and non-necessity, which makes his presence valued and his opinion sought. The common man's constant need for company makes him cheap. His presence is ubiquitous, and therefore taken for granted. The philosophical royalty understands that scarcity creates value. His deliberate isolation renders his occasional presence a gift, his words meaningful, and his time precious. He is not defined by who he accompanies, but by the quiet power of his self-contained world. We close this meditation not on the tragedy of loneliness, but on the triumph of self-mastery. The man with no ring lives like royalty because he has achieved the ultimate form of personal wealth, the complete, undisputed ownership of his inner life. He has traded the boisterous, illusory rewards of societal validation for the silent, inarguable reward of philosophical freedom. He is the master of his waking hours, the sole director of his intellectual pursuits, and the final arbiter of his emotional peace. He has found contentment not by chasing pleasure, but by strategically avoiding pain. And in this negative freedom, he discovers the greatest positive affirmation of existence. His life is an eloquent, silent rebuke to the noise, the hurry, and the mandatory dissatisfaction of the collective. This journey has defined the highest form of self-sovereignty. Now we must articulate it simply. We are constructing a manifesto for those who prioritize peace above all else, for those who seek the intellectual throne. What is the single most powerful phrase, the ultimate mantra, that encapsulates this Schopenhauerian freedom, the essence of living like royalty in silence? Let us know in the comments below. We are building a fortress of independent thought, connecting those who refuse the constraints of the conventional life. Join this movement now by subscribing to this channel, affirming your commitment to philosophical independence and intellectual depth. You are not alone in seeking this higher path, and we honor your choice by providing relentless, uncompromised analysis. Hit the like button on this video to solidify the energy that rejects the common struggle. And as we prepare to continue this exploration of ultimate strength, next week we will shift our focus to the cold, undeniable mathematics of influence, revealing the one principle the world's most successful manipulators use to calculate your psychological vulnerabilities. a lesson in defense that you absolutely must understand. Your ascent to mastery demands this knowledge,